Hi everybody. First of all, I'd just like to say a really big thank you to everybody who posted really lovely comments yesterday and really lovely feedback, like either via email or on the feed at the bottom. I really didn't expect to get quite so much feedback straight away, and it's really lovely to see. So hopefully, if these continue to be useful, I'm going to keep making a few more. I have tried to sort out the audio on this video as well, just to make it a little bit louder, as I realised it was quite quiet the other one. So hopefully, if there's any other technical issues, people just let me know. What we're going to do today is our second lesson. We're going to have a focus on Sheila Birling. So what I'm going to consider is the characters in order of their interrogations by the inspector. So obviously we had yesterday we had Mr. Birling. Today we're going to have a look at Sheila. Sheila's one of the interesting characters in the play, as she's one of the characters who develops the biggest change, and therefore when we're looking at making points about her, we can make a variety. So once again, we're going to have some key vocabulary that's going to appear on the screen. These words, some of these are antonyms of each other, so there are a variety of different ways that we can explore Sheila. Again, your task is to have a look at these pieces of vocabulary and see what they mean and how you think you may be able to apply these to the character. One of the ways to approach the character of Sheila is to consider how she changes and how she develops across the play, much more so than Mr. Birling than we were discussing yesterday, where he doesn't really change at all. Sheila shows some marked differences between the way she behaves at the start of the play and prior to the play beginning and at the end of the play. One particularly useful thing to do is to track her use of vocabulary, the way she speaks to people, the language that she is using herself. It's also important to remember that the whole reason for the Birlings and Gerald gathering that evening is Sheila's engagement, so you can argue that Sheila is the central focus of the play, and certainly her transformation is one of the key elements that we're going to be discussing today. When considering a character such as Sheila, it's obviously important to consider the context at the time that Priestley was both writing and setting the play. We're consistently reminded that Sheila is living in a patriarchal society, a society that's dominated by the male figures of the household. For example, when the engagement ring is produced, it's the one that Gerald wanted her to have. Gerald is in control. Mr. Birling quite regularly tells her to be quiet, Sheila. There's a lot of control and dominance going on there. So one of Priestley's big ideas is considering the way that women are treated in society. You can argue that Sheila is a foil for Eva Smith and two young women who are operating in the same society but obviously in different social spectrums. We can also have a look at the way in which the older characters and the younger characters are behaving. Sheila, as a younger character, is seen as more malleable, more changeable, and is able to reflect on her behaviour a lot more than the older characters. Priestley's big idea is not necessarily the pessimism that you might expect, that the whole world is doomed. Priestley's actually very, very optimistic about what the youth can do and what the youth can do to change the world around them. One of the things that the audience are drawn to, certainly at the start of the play, is Sheila's obsession with material goods. We can argue that she is as materialistic a character as any other in the play. One of the first things, one of the first exchanges that we have with Sheila is to do with the ring that Gerald proposes to her with. When she receives it, she says that now she really feels engaged. Now, if we take this ring as a symbol or a metaphor for Sheila's relationship with capitalism, the engagement ring, possibly one of the most expensive gifts anyone will ever receive, usually associated with great wealth and great status. Now, Sheila takes this ring and now she really feels engaged. She's embracing this capitalist philosophy. However, as the play develops and the rejection of the ring might suggest a change in Sheila's behaviour. Likewise, when she first hears about Eva Smith and hears about her horrible suicide, the phrase she uses, the question that she asks is, was she young, pretty? Sheila's immediate reflection on this is the looks of the young woman, which again gives us some insight into the way that her mind works. At the start of the play, she is seen as someone who relies heavily on her parents, and certainly relies on them to get her understanding of the wider world. If you look at the vocabulary that she uses when addressing her parents, it's quite often the use of the word mummy or daddy, suggesting this immaturity and inexperience. One of Sheila's most prominent characteristics at the start of the play is her temper, her anger and her aggression. And as the play continues, Sheila comes to realise the effect that her anger has, particularly as the daughter of a man of high status. Her words have more clout, her words and her actions have more impact on other people than she perhaps realises. As the inspector interrogates her, and she comes to realise that she has had this interaction with Eva Smith, she tries to dismiss what she did by saying that she was in a furious temper. Likewise, she feels that Eva has been impertinent, meaning rude, to her, and cheeky. Now, what Sheila doesn't comprehend is that her reaction, that she went straight to the manager, has these far-reaching consequences for Eva Smith. That her role as a high-status woman, compared to Eva, has this extra impact that she doesn't potentially realise. There's limited opportunities at the start of the play to understand Sheila's potential aggression. She does have a sharp side. Eric, when making the toast to celebrate her engagement, mentions her nasty temper, to which she responds calling him a chump. This foreshadowing of the behavioural trait which will ultimately lead to her involvement with the Eva Smith case. Furthermore, as the inspector's interrogation comes to its conclusion, Sheila bursts into tears and says, "How was I to know?" What Priestley's doing here is he's using Sheila's characteristics, Sheila's flaws, if you like, if we want to bring in the idea of the 7 deadly sins, Sheila's wrath, and how this has far-reaching and significant reactions in the wider world. Sheila starts to realise how we are members of one body, and how that other people are completely affected by what she's done and how she behaves. One of the things that sets Sheila apart from a lot of the other characters, particularly her parents and Gerald, is her ability to reflect on her actions and to understand the consequences of what she has done. Initially, when the interrogation with the inspector is taking place, Sheila tries in some ways to excuse herself, saying, "I couldn't feel sorry for her because she was so pretty with these big dark eyes. She felt that she could take care of herself." However, as soon as she realises what the consequences of her actions are, Sheila immediately starts to take responsibility. If we contrast this with her father yesterday, in the video that we did yesterday, where he says, "I cannot accept responsibility," one of Sheila's phrases that almost parallels this is, "So I'm really responsible." Likewise, when her father's talking about the women of the factory, almost like business transactions, saying, "I refused, of course, for the wages," Sheila responds with, "These girls aren't cheap labour, they're people." This is one of the occasions in the play where we see Priestley's voice being embodied within a character. Priestley's message is coming to the audience through Sheila. As the play comes to its conclusion, Sheila continues to respond in using the language that the inspector has used with her. She says it doesn't alter the fact that we all helped to kill her. And as the inspector leaves, when the other characters are trying to dismiss him, she says, "I remember how he made me feel." Sheila has demonstrated one of the greatest changes within the play. her personality is completely altered from this capitalist, greedy, materialistic view of the world to a much more socialist, a much more responsible way of looking out for other people. One thing we might want to consider with the character of Sheila is, considering the Edwardian context of the play, is Sheila's role as a commodity or potentially as a bargaining chip within the capitalist world. Mr. Birling seems to almost treat Sheila as a piece of business. The union with Crofts Limited is seen almost like a business transaction, and the union of the two families through Sheila is therefore going to be treated almost as a business rather than a romantic engagement. When Sheila is speaking to Gerald, she says she doesn't seem to know him at all, which could signify that this is a relationship built on commodity and built on business friendships rather than built on romance. This is emblematic with the engagement ring, obviously, which Sheila returns to Gerald when learning about his affair. Mr. Birling is the first person to speak up in defence of Gerald about how young men behave in this particular manner. He is the one who is most pressing for this engagement to happen and most keen for these two families to be united for lower costs and for higher prices. Sheila is emblematic and a microcosm of these young women of the time who are treated as business rather than individual people. One consideration we might have with the character Sheila is the stagecraft that has been embedded within the play from Priestley. Obviously, as a performance, we don't get to see any of these phrases or little indications that Priestley's put in there. However, as we read the play, then we do get to see this. Sheila is described as a pretty girl in her early 20s, very pleased with life and rather excited, obviously at the start of the play. Now, this is significant, the rather excited. Actresses playing Sheila will very often have this very excitable manner at the start of the play, where we have a lot of very emotive and over-the-top, almost explosive dialogue from Sheila, and as the play progresses, she becomes more mature and she becomes more sophisticated in her behaviour. Likewise, it's something you might want to consider with staging and costume. Many productions of An Inspector Calls will have Sheila in white, compared to the men who are obviously in black suits, and a mother who's generally in a darker dress. Now, this could be considered an embodiment of Sheila's innocence or her purity, or the fact that she's now a beacon that we can look for inspiration and optimism for the future. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been a useful summary of some of the key factors that we might consider when looking at the character of Sheila. The same as the previous video, I've added some essay questions at the end of this video. Once we've covered the 5 main characters within An Inspector Calls, we will be having a look at some essay responses and having a look at paragraphing and having a look at how we can improve our writing style. But for now, if you'd like to have a look at any of these essay questions, or if you'd like to attempt an essay plan, or if you'd like to actually have a go at a few paragraphs from this essay, then please feel free to email me and pass that through. Apart from that, please stay safe, and if you hang on, there'll be the film recommendation at the end. Okay, so for our second film recommendation, I'm going to go back to the 80s and we're going to be recommending Ghostbusters. obviously we're all familiar with the soundtrack, but it's actually surprising when you chat to people, the amount of people who haven't actually seen this film. It's an absolutely iconic film from the 80s. The special effects still stand up really, really well. A lot of really interesting practical effects that have been used there. It is really, really funny looking at the idea of blue-collar exterminator characters in New York City, but they just happen to work with ghosts. So check it out. It is fantastically funny. Bill Murray's finest performance, in my opinion. I'm going to do the classic YouTuber thing now and saying if you'd like to like and subscribe, that'd be great. And until next time, stay safe.